The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the buildings of downtown Chester when Frank Thompson started his daily walk to Lucy's Diner. At 93 years old, his steps were slower than they used to be, but his routine never changed. He had been following the same path for the past 10 years, ever since his beloved wife Martha had passed away. Frank's appearance told the story of a life well lived. His clean-pressed plaid shirt was always tucked neatly into khaki pants that had been carefully ironed the night before. The old military cap he wore sat proudly on his white hair, its World War II veteran pins gleaming in the morning light. In his hand, he carried a worn brown leather wallet that his grandson had given him 5 birthdays ago. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., Frank would push open the glass door of Lucy's Diner, causing the little bell above to ring. The sound was like music to the staff's ears. It meant Frank had arrived, and all was right with the world. The small diner, with its checkered floor and red vinyl booths, had become his second home. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson." Sarah, the young waitress with kind eyes and a gentle smile, would call out. She had been working at the diner for 3 years now, and Frank had watched her grow from a nervous teenager into a confident young woman. She didn't even need to take his order anymore. She knew it by heart. Frank would make his way to booth number 7, his favorite spot by the window. He liked it because the morning light fell just right on his newspaper, and he could watch the town wake up. The vinyl seat had a small crack on the left side, and the table had a tiny scratch near the napkin holder. These imperfections were familiar friends to Frank, just like everything else in the diner. Sarah would quickly appear with his regular order: 1 cup of black coffee, no sugar, and 2 slices of wheat toast with a small pat of butter on the side. Frank would carefully arrange everything on his table: toast on the right, coffee on the left, and his reading glasses in the middle. Then he would pull out his newspaper, which he bought every morning from Joe's newsstand around the corner. The other regular customers knew not to disturb Frank during his morning routine. They would wave hello or nod respectfully as they passed his booth. Many of them were curious about the stories behind the military medals pinned to his cap, but they never asked. There was something dignified about the way Frank sat there, quietly reading his paper and sipping his coffee. The diner's owner, Lucy Martinez, had a special spot in her heart for Frank. Her own father had been a World War II veteran, and she saw in Frank the same quiet strength and dignity that she remembered in her dad. She made sure the staff knew that Frank's coffee cup should never be empty, and there should always be a fresh pot brewing when he arrived. As Frank read his paper, he would sometimes pause to look at the old black and white photograph he kept in his wallet. It showed a young soldier standing proudly in his uniform, arm in arm with a beautiful young woman in a flowered dress. The edges of the photo were worn smooth from years of handling, but the memories it held were still crystal clear in Frank's mind. For 2 hours every morning, Frank would sit in his booth, methodically working his way through every section of the newspaper. He never skipped a single article, believing that staying informed was a citizen's duty. The world had changed so much since his young days, but he made it his mission to understand and keep up with the times. When the clock struck 9, Frank would carefully fold his newspaper, leave his usual tip for Sarah, always exactly 20%, calculated to the penny, and slowly stand up from his booth. He would adjust his cap, smooth down his shirt, and give a small nod to Lucy behind the counter. Then he would make his way back out into the world, ready to face another day. This had been Frank's routine for 10 years, as dependable as the sunrise. The staff and regular customers of Lucy's Diner couldn't imagine their mornings without the quiet presence of the elderly veteran in booth number 7. Little did they know that their peaceful morning routine was about to face an unexpected disruption that would change everything. The change came on a bright Tuesday morning in early spring. The cherry trees outside Lucy's Diner were just starting to bloom when the first rumble of motorcycle engines shook the diner's windows. At first, it was just a distant sound, but it grew louder and louder until the coffee cups on the tables began to rattle. 7 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. The bikes were big, black machines that looked dangerous and powerful. The leader's motorcycle had a bright red snake painted on its fuel tank, twisting around the metal like it was alive. The riders themselves were just as intimidating as their machines. They wore black leather jackets covered in patches and metal studs. Their leader was a tall, muscular man who everyone soon learned called himself Snake. He had thick arms covered in tattoos and a long beard that he had braided with small metal beads. When he walked, his heavy boots made the wooden floor of the diner creak. Sarah, who was carrying a pot of coffee to Frank's table, nearly dropped it when the bikers pushed through the door. The little bell above the entrance didn't just ring, it jangled wildly as the door slammed open. The peaceful morning atmosphere that the diner's regular customers loved disappeared in an instant. "Nice little place you got here," Snake announced loudly, his voice carrying across the entire diner. He sprawled across a booth meant for 4 people, while his fellow bikers spread out to occupy 3 more tables. Their leather jackets creaked as they sat down, and their chains jingled against the tables. Lucy Martinez came out from behind the counter, trying to maintain her professional smile. "Welcome to Lucy's Diner," she said, handing them menus. "Can I start you gentlemen off with some coffee?" "Coffee?" Snake laughed, and his friends joined in. "Got any beer?" When Lucy explained they didn't serve alcohol, he shrugged dramatically. "Guess coffee will have to do. Bring enough for my whole crew." The bikers made themselves at home in the worst possible way. They would prop their boots up on the seats, flick cigarette ashes onto the floor, even though there was a no smoking sign clearly visible, and talk so loudly that other customers couldn't hear their own conversations. Every few minutes, one of them would go outside to rev their motorcycle engine, making the diner's windows rattle. Regular customers began to leave earlier than usual. Mrs. Henderson, who always came in for her mid-morning tea and muffin, took one look at the bikers and turned around at the door. Mr. Parker, a high school principal, moved to a table far from the bikers when one of them started telling inappropriate jokes in a voice that carried across the room. The staff tried their best to adapt. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she served the bikers their coffee, especially when they made comments about her uniform or called her sweetheart, in a way that wasn't friendly at all. Lucy spent more time than usual standing near the phone, ready to call the police if things got out of hand. The worst part was how they treated the diner itself. They would spill coffee and not clean it up, leave their trash on the tables, and scratch the leather seats with their metal belt buckles. When they finally left, after spending 2 hours being as disruptive as possible, they would rev their engines extra loud, as if announcing their departure to the whole neighborhood. This wasn't a one-time visit. The next day, they came back at the same time, and the day after that, it became clear that Snake and his gang had decided to make Lucy's Diner their new morning hangout spot. Each day, they seemed to get a little louder, a little more disrespectful, taking up more space and caring less about the other customers. The peaceful routine of Lucy's Diner had been completely disrupted. The morning sunlight still streamed through the windows, the coffee was still hot and fresh, and the toast was still served perfectly golden brown. But now there was tension in the air, a feeling of unease that hung over the place like a storm cloud. And no one, not even Lucy herself, knew quite what to do about it. It didn't take long for Snake and his gang to notice Frank Thompson. The elderly veteran stood out in his pressed clothes and military cap, moving carefully through his morning routine while they sprawled across their tables. At first, they just watched him, but soon their amusement turned mean. "Hey, look who's here!" Snake would announce loudly whenever Frank entered the diner. "It's father time." His gang would laugh on cue, their voices echoing off the walls. Frank tried to ignore them, keeping his eyes on his newspaper as he made his way to his usual booth. Sarah noticed how Frank's hands would shake slightly now when she brought him his coffee, though he tried to hide it. She started bringing his breakfast before the bikers usually arrived, hoping he could enjoy at least a few peaceful moments. But the gang began showing up earlier and earlier, as if they knew. One morning, a biker with a skull tattooed on his neck deliberately stretched out his leg as Frank walked past. The elderly man stumbled but caught himself on a nearby table. The bikers roared with laughter. "Better watch your step, Grandpa," the tattooed man said, grinning. "Those retirement home floors can be slippery." Lucy Martinez saw the whole thing from behind the counter. She wanted to throw them out, but Snake had made veiled threats about accidents happening to businesses that weren't friendly to his gang. She had her staff and other customers to think about. Still, she made sure to check on Frank more often, bringing him fresh coffee and asking if he needed anything. The harassment got worse as days went by. The bikers would bump Frank's table while walking past, making his coffee spill onto his newspaper. They would throw wadded-up napkins in his direction when Lucy wasn't looking. Sometimes they would sit in the booths around him, talking loudly about how some people were too old to be out in public. Frank never complained. He would simply clean up the spilled coffee with his napkin, straighten his newspaper, and continue reading. But Sarah noticed how his shoulders seemed to slope more each day, how the proud military bearing he'd always shown was starting to fade. The sparkle in his eyes was dimming. Other customers tried to help in small ways. Mrs. Henderson would sometimes sit at Frank's table, chatting with him about her garden until the bikers got bored and focused on someone else. Mr. Parker, the high school principal, started greeting Frank loudly each morning, making sure the bikers knew the veteran had friends. But these small acts of kindness couldn't completely shield Frank from the daily torment. The bikers seemed to take special delight in mocking his military service. They would stand at attention and salute him mockingly when he walked by. Snake started calling him General, drawing out the word to make it sound like an insult. One morning, they went too far, as Frank was getting ready to leave, carefully folding his newspaper and putting it under his arm. One of the bikers knocked into his table hard enough to send his coffee cup flying. A hot liquid splashed across Frank's carefully pressed shirt and the photograph he'd just been looking at, the one of him and his late wife Martha. Frank's hands trembled as he picked up the wet photograph, trying to dry it with his napkin. The image was already starting to blur. 60 years of carrying that picture in his wallet. And now the precious image was damaged. The bikers laughed as usual, but this time, something changed in Frank's eyes. Lucy and Sarah watched anxiously as Frank slowly put the photograph back in his wallet. They could see how his jaw was set tight, how his hands had stopped shaking. The old soldier straightened his cap with careful precision. Tomorrow would be different. They could sense it. Tomorrow, Frank Thompson would not simply endure another day of torment. The next morning would bring something new, though none of them, not even Frank himself, knew exactly what that would be. The next morning dawned gray and cloudy, matching the mood inside Lucy's diner. Frank Thompson arrived at his usual time of 7 a.m., his damaged photograph carefully stored in a plastic sleeve to prevent further harm. Something was different today. His usual booth, number 7, was already occupied. Snake and 3 of his gang members had sprawled across Frank's regular spot. Their leather jackets were thrown across the cracked vinyl seats, and motorcycle helmets occupied the spaces where Frank usually placed his coffee and toast. Empty cups and half-eaten plates of food cluttered the table. Sarah, who had been watching anxiously from behind the counter, hurried forward. "Mr. Thompson, I can set you up at another table," she offered quickly, pointing to an empty booth near the kitchen. But Frank didn't move. He stood there, his military cap slightly adjusted, looking at his booth of 10 years. The diner had gone quiet. Regular customers stopped eating, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. Lucy Martinez stepped out from the kitchen, dish towel still in her hands. Even the usually noisy bikers at other tables fell silent, watching to see what would happen. Snake looked up slowly, a mocking smile spreading beneath his braided beard. "Something wrong, General?" he asked, stretching out deliberately in the booth. "Seems like you're a little lost. Senior moment, maybe." His friends snickered, but their laughter sounded forced, as if they sensed something different in the air. Frank's voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "That's my table." The words hung in the air like morning mist. Snake's smile widened as he made a show of looking around the booth. "Funny, I don't see your name on it anywhere. Do you boys see any names here?" His gang members shook their heads, grinning. "I've sat there every morning for 10 years, Frank continued, his voice steady. "My wife Martha and I used to share breakfast in that booth. After she passed, I kept coming because it felt like she was still here with me." He paused, then added softly, "It's my table." Snake leaned forward, his massive arms resting on the table. "Well, maybe it's time for a change, old-timer. Why don't you go fight another war or something? Leave the good spots to people who can actually enjoy them." The diner seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Henderson gasped quietly from her seat near the window. Mr. Parker stood up from his table, ready to intervene. Sarah had tears in her eyes, and Lucy's hands were clenched around her dish towel. Frank stood very still. In that moment, something shifted in his bearing. The slight stoop in his shoulders disappeared. His spine straightened, and his chin lifted slightly, the way it had done countless times during military inspections decades ago. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The fluorescent lights at the diner reflected off the medals pinned to his cap. Medals earned in battles fought long before Snake was born. His eyes, usually gentle and tired, now held the steel that hadn't been seen since his days in uniform. For 10 years, Frank had quietly endured life's changes. He had survived the loss of his beloved Martha, adapted to a world that moved too fast, and accepted the limitations that came with age. He had weathered the bikers' taunts and harassment with dignity. But this was different. This wasn't just about a booth in a diner. This was about respect, about memory, about standing up for something that mattered. Snake must have sensed the change too. His smile faltered slightly as he looked at the old veteran. The usual cruel amusement in his eyes wavered, replaced by something that might have been uncertainty. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The moment stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight. Everyone in the diner knew they were about to witness something important, something that would change everything. Frank Thompson, the quiet veteran who had endured so much, was about to make his stand. Frank Thompson took one step forward. His polished brown shoes made a soft sound on the diner's tiled floor, but in the complete silence, it seemed as loud as a thunderclap. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the metals on his cap, making them shine. "Young man," Frank began, his voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone in the diner, including himself. "I've been quiet for too long." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. From inside, he carefully removed the damaged photograph, now protected in its plastic sleeve. "This picture was taken in 1943, he continued, holding it up so Snake and his gang could see. "I was 19 years old, standing next to my wife Martha on the day I shipped out to the Pacific. We had been married for exactly 6 days." The bikers stared at the photograph, their usual smirks fading as they saw the young soldier in his crisp uniform, standing proud and tall next to his beautiful bride. Snake's face twitched slightly, something unreadable passing across his features. 3 days after this picture was taken, I was on a ship headed for islands whose names I couldn't even pronounce, Frank said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I spent 3 years in places like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. I watched boys younger than you die in the mud, holding pictures of their own sweethearts and wives." The diner was absolutely still. Sarah had stopped pouring coffee midstream. Lucy stood with her hand over her mouth. Even the usual morning traffic outside seemed to have gone quiet, as if the whole world was listening to Frank's words. "I saw things no man should ever have to see," Frank continued, carefully putting the photograph back in his wallet. "I lost friends who were closer than brothers. We fought not because we wanted to, but because we had to. We fought for the people we loved back home, and for something bigger than ourselves, freedom." Frank's eyes swept across the group of bikers, meeting each gaze directly. Some looked away, unable to hold his stare. "That freedom means you can ride your motorcycles wherever you want. It means you can wear whatever you like and say whatever you choose. It means you can sit in any diner in this great country." Then Frank drew himself up to his full height. Though he stood only 5'9", in that moment he seemed to tower over everyone in the room. His voice, when it came, was like rolling thunder. "But that freedom was bought with American blood. My blood. My friend's blood. When you mock my age, you mock every year I've carried the weight of what we did and what we saw. When you laugh at my routine, you laugh at the peace I fought to protect. When you disrespect this place, you disrespect every soldier who never made it home to enjoy a quiet breakfast in a free country." Frank took another step forward, now standing directly beside the booth. "I'm not asking you to leave this table anymore. I'm telling you that you're sitting in a spot that was earned with sacrifice. A spot where I've spent 10 years remembering my Martha, my friends, and a time when young men like you understood the meaning of respect." The silence that followed his words was absolute. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long rays through the diner's windows that seemed to spotlight Frank as he stood there, straight-backed and unwavering. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of history and truth. Snake sat completely still, his earlier cockiness gone. His gang members looked at their boots, their coffee cups, anywhere but at the old veteran who stood before them like a living monument to sacrifice and courage. The other customers in the diner watched with held breath, waiting to see what would happen next. In that suspended moment, something changed in the atmosphere of Lucy's diner. The air itself seemed charged with dignity and respect, as if Frank's words had awakened something long forgotten in everyone who heard them. And in the faces of the bikers, particularly in Snake's expression, the first signs of transformation began to show. The silence in Lucy's diner stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, slowly, Snake stood up from the booth. His massive frame towered over Frank, but somehow the old veteran didn't look small beside him. The other bikers watched nervously, unsure of what their leader would do. Snake's hand moved toward his neck, and several people in the diner tensed. But instead of making a threatening gesture, he pulled out a silver chain that had been hidden under his leather jacket. On the chain hung a pair of scratched and weathered military dog tags. "My father's," Snake said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. His fingers wrapped around the metal tags, holding them like something precious. "Marine Corps, Vietnam, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines." Frank's eyes moved from Snake's face to the dog tags and back again. The morning sunlight caught the metal, making the engraved letters visible to everyone nearby. The tough biker's usual sneer was gone, replaced by something vulnerable and raw. "He passed away last year," Snake continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Cancer from Agent Orange. Fought it for 15 years, just like he fought everything else in his life." He swallowed hard, looking down at the dog tags in his hand. "Never talked much about the war, but he had a picture like yours, him and my mom before he shipped out. Kept it in his wallet until the day he died." The other bikers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was a side of their leader they'd never seen before. Sarah, still standing by the counter with her coffee pot, wiped tears from her eyes. Lucy pressed her dish towel to her mouth, trying to stay quiet. "Last time I saw him conscious," Snake went on, "he was in the VA hospital. Told me to be a better man than he was. Said he wished he found a way to make peace with his memories instead of running from them." He looked around the diner, seeing it with new eyes. "Guess I've been doing my own kind of running." Frank reached out slowly and touched the dog tags. His weathered fingers traced the embossed letters with the gentleness of someone who understood their significance. "2nd Battalion, 5th Marines," he repeated softly. "They were heroes in Vietnam. Your father was a brave man." Snake's tough exterior cracked just a little more. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, he was. Called himself a simple grunt, but he had more medals than he ever talked about. Found them in a box in his closet after." He couldn't finish the sentence. The other bikers began to stand up, moving away from Frank's booth with a respect they'd never shown before. One of them quickly wiped down the table, while another straightened the chairs. They worked silently, efficiently, like a military unit following unspoken orders. "Sir," Snake said, drawing himself up straight. For the first time, the word wasn't mocking. It was filled with genuine respect. "Would you?" He paused, struggling with words that didn't usually come easily to him. "Would you tell me about the Pacific? About what it was like? Dad never wanted to share his stories, but maybe hearing yours would help me understand him better." Frank looked at his booth, now clean and ready for him, then back at Snake. The morning light streaming through the window seemed to soften, creating a gentle glow around the unlikely pair. The elderly veteran in his pressed clothes and polished shoes, and the tough biker with his father's dog tags still clutched in his hand. The rest of the diner watched in amazement as Frank Thompson, who had stood his ground with the courage of a soldier, now showed the compassion of one too. The transformation in the air was almost magical, like watching a bridge being built between two generations, two kinds of pain, two ways of understanding sacrifice and service. Lucy quietly signaled to Sarah, who began preparing fresh coffee. The morning rush crowd watched as history and healing came together in their familiar local diner. Something new was beginning, something none of them had expected when the sun rose that morning. Sarah brought over 2 fresh cups of coffee as Frank settled into his usual spot in booth number 7. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Snake sat across from him, his massive frame looking almost awkward as he tried to show proper respect. The other bikers had pulled chairs nearby, forming a loose circle around the booth. "We hit the beach at dawn," Frank began, his hands wrapped around the warm coffee cup. The sun was just coming up, painting the sky pink and orange. Beautiful morning. Then the shooting started. His voice was steady, but his eyes saw something far away and long ago. Snake leaned forward, his father's dog tags now laying on the table between them like a bridge between their worlds. The other bikers listened intently, their usual rowdy behavior completely forgotten. Even those who had seemed the toughest now sat quiet and attentive, like schoolboys learning an important lesson. "Your father would understand this," Frank continued, looking directly at Snake. "In war, you learn quick that the guy next to you, he's not just your buddy, He's your lifeline. Your brother. Doesn't matter where he's from, what color his skin is, or what church he goes to. All that matters is that he's there, watching your back, just like you're watching his. One of the younger bikers, who had been among the loudest in mocking Frank earlier, wiped his eyes quickly when he thought no one was looking. Another reached out and squeezed his shoulder, understanding in the gesture. Lucy brought over a plate of fresh toast, Frank's usual order, and set it in the middle of the table. Without being asked, she added extra plates for sharing. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the steam rising from their coffee cups and creating small halos of light. "Got a picture of my unit," Frank said, carefully opening his wallet again. He pulled out another photograph, this one creased and worn at the edges. "That's Jimmy from Georgia, Dave from New York, Mike from Kansas." His finger moved across the faces of young men frozen in time, each name carrying the weight of memory. Snake handled the photograph with surprising gentleness, his rough hands treating it like a precious artifact. "Just like Dad's old photos," he said softly. "He kept them in a shoebox under his bed. Never showed them to anyone, but I found him looking at them sometimes, late at night." As Frank shared more stories, something remarkable happened in the diner. Other customers began to join in, drawn by the power of the moment. Mr. Parker mentioned his uncle who served in Korea. Mrs. Henderson talked about her grandfather in World War I. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of shared experience and understanding. The bikers, who had entered the diner as intimidating figures, transformed before everyone's eyes. They asked respectful questions, shared stories about Snake's father, and showed genuine interest in Frank's experiences. Their leather jackets and tough appearances no longer seemed threatening. They were just men, learning about sacrifice and service from someone who had lived it. "Your father?" Frank said to Snake, his voice gentle but firm. "He carried his war with him, just like I carry mine. Sometimes the weight of it is heavy. Sometimes it's easier to be angry than to be hurt. But there's healing in sharing the load, son, and letting others understand." Snake nodded, unable to speak for a moment. His hand still held his father's dog tags, but his grip had relaxed, as if some of the pain he carried had eased just a little. Sarah moved quietly among them, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates. She noticed how the bikers now said please and thank you, how they made sure not to crowd Frank's space, how they listened with genuine respect. The transformation wasn't just in their behavior, it was in their eyes, their postures, their whole way of being. The morning stretched on, but nobody seemed to notice the time passing. The usual breakfast rush came and went around them, but booth number 7 had become a sacred space where past and present met, where old wounds began to heal, and where understanding bridged the gap between generations. Frank's morning routine had changed forever, but as he looked around at the faces of these men, these sons and grandsons of America's veterans, he knew that something far more important had taken its place. The next morning, Frank Thompson approached Lucy's diner at his usual time of 7 a.m. As he got closer, he heard motorcycle engines, and for a brief moment, his steps faltered. Then he saw something that made him stop completely. Snake and his gang were already there, but they weren't causing trouble. Instead, they were lined up on either side of the diner's entrance, their bikes perfectly parked and gleaming in the morning sun. As Frank got closer, Snake stepped forward and opened the door for him. "Good morning, sir," Snake said, standing straight and tall. The other bikers nodded respectfully, some of them even removing their caps. The morning light caught the silver chain around Snake's neck, where his father's dog tags still hung, now displayed proudly instead of hidden. Inside, Frank found his booth. Number 7 had been carefully prepared. The table was spotlessly clean, and fresh flowers sat in a small vase by the window. His newspaper was already there, neatly folded, and Sarah was approaching with his coffee and toast. "The guys picked up your paper from Joe's newsstand," Sarah explained, smiling as she set down his breakfast. "They wanted to make sure it wasn't creased." Her eyes were bright with happiness at the change in the diner's atmosphere. The bikers settled into nearby tables, but not before asking politely if they could join Frank again. Their leather jackets and tough appearances hadn't changed, but their manner was completely different. They moved with a new awareness, showing respect not just to Frank, but to everyone in the diner. This became the new morning routine at Lucy's diner. The bikers appointed themselves as unofficial guardians of Frank's breakfast time. They made sure his coffee was always hot, His newspaper was always ready, and no one ever disturbed his peace. But more than that, they became students of history, eager listeners to the stories of sacrifice and service. Other veterans, hearing about what happened, began to visit the diner. They found a welcoming space where their stories were valued and their experiences understood. Snake and his gang showed the same respect to each one, creating an unexpected brotherhood between the older veterans and the younger generation. Lucy noticed how her business actually improved. Customers who had been scared away by the bikers' previous behavior returned, drawn by the remarkable transformation. The diner became known as a place where respect and understanding bridged all gaps: age, background, and appearance. Every Thursday morning, Snake would bring in old photographs and letters from his father's time in Vietnam. Frank would help him understand the military terms, the locations, the experiences his father had never been able to talk about. Together, they pieced together the story of another brave soldier, healing old wounds in the process. Mrs. Henderson now brought her grandchildren to the diner, knowing they would hear important stories about courage and sacrifice. Mr. Parker sometimes brought his high school history students, letting them learn about war and peace from those who had experienced it firsthand. The diner had become more than a restaurant. It was a living classroom of American history. The bikers changed in other ways too. They started organizing motorcycle rides to raise money for veteran causes. Their leather jackets now carried patches honoring military service alongside their usual symbols. Some of them even began volunteering at the local VA hospital, spending time with veterans who didn't have family to visit them. Frank's peaceful morning routine had transformed into something far more meaningful. Though he still read his newspaper and enjoyed his coffee and toast, he was no longer alone with his memories. Instead, he had become a bridge between generations, helping young men like Snake understand the true meaning of service, sacrifice, and respect. One morning, about 6 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Frank arrived to find a new addition to his booth. A small brass plaque had been mounted on the wall, reading, "Reserved for Frank Thompson and friends, in honor of all who served." Below it hung a carefully framed photograph showing Frank in his youth, standing proud in his military uniform. The story of the 93-year-old veteran and the bikers became a local legend, shared with pride by everyone who witnessed it. It reminded people that beneath tough exteriors and prejudgments often lie unexpected connections, and that it's never too late for understanding to bridge the gaps between generations. Every morning at Lucy's Diner, as the sun rises over the town, Frank's booth continues to be a place where respect is served daily, stories are shared, and the bonds of brotherhood transcend all boundaries.